Yes, thank you. And we can immediately go to the next slide. It's Alfred here again. So I'm going to talk to you more about security off the cloud. I think previously you've gone through the shared responsibility model, but more focused this time on data security and compliance and the work we do around it. So to give you a bit more of background, the regulatory view and challenges in sub-Saharan Africa is that we do see a regional breakdown of East, West, and Southern Africa. In these regions, we have a varied maturity of both regulations and regulators. What I mean by that is in different countries and different regions, you will see that sometimes regulations are gone through the whole process of being gazetted, tabled in Parliament. It is published, enacted upon, and in data protection acts that they even have a data commissioner that's enacting the laws. But also in other countries or regions, you have that they do not have these regulations yet. They're in processes or different stages of processes of drafting these regulations and having public participation, or, it's just a complete lack of that. And that brings you to the regulators itself, in where their maturity have got different stages. And the key there is for the education to happen with the regulators to enable them and to empower them to make learned decisions when regulations are drafted, published, and that's a type of route that we typically follow and work with. I also find that the financial services industry is the most active in leading the regulations, but it's also just one of the industries that we see out there actively engaged, and it could be a good or bad thing. Good in that they can give a lot of guidance to the regulators as a whole in the country, bad in that it sometimes brings ambiguity because the FSI industry might have different viewpoints on data security than other industries might have. The typical themes encountered and the challenges that you sit within the environment is, and I'll talk about this just in the next slide, which is data residency, sovereignty, and localization, the ambiguity around it, understanding the differences. There's also contractual obligations. And when we get to Robin, you can talk to him about the enterprise agreements, where we put our exit clauses and we end up lock-in protection for the customer, which is very key. And new themes that are coming up is critical infrastructure and resiliency. I've seen it at a number of roundtables that I participate in, and it's something that I'll quickly touch on in this presentation as well. And we can move to the next slide. Thanks. So if we look at regulatory challenges, we typically look at what can be done and moved immediately or changed, and what cannot, which are your long-term type of challenges. So when we talk about hard blockers, the long-term challenges, that is where, if we focus specifically on data sovereignty and or localization, countries have an absolute stance of no cloud, no outsourcing allowed. And that's typically a very long engagement that myself and my division and our public policy, we work with the regulators. We build trust, we work on influencing and educating them to align more to international standards. Because if you look at the regulatory regime and the laws that are not in place, missing or outstanding in certain of these countries, that's typically the issue. It's not aligned to the African Union or ITU declarations, and it's also not aligned to international standards or best practices. And that's key when formulating regulations, is that you need to have some alignment to these international standards. In the softer blockers, that is more the manageable environment, and that is where we can work with you as customers, and where we do work with your customers and regulators at the same time. For data residency or localization is clearing up ambiguity in the regulations, providing education again, understanding what it entails, and more importantly, understanding what the regulation says and what security or compliance attestation and the features that you need to implement to get to that level of compliance that is necessary. Sometimes you think that there's a process, or there might not be a process because it could be arduous and long-standing. But as long as there is a process, one can work through it, and we can assist you in that, in providing that attestation, the surety that you need to get to the approval for using cloud. We can move on to the next slide. So when we get to what is data residency, sovereignty, and localization, it's important to understand the differences per definition, what it is, so that when you read it in a regulation, you can understand if the regulation is referring to it correctly or what the implications of that would be. So if we talk about data residency, it's the requirement as to where all or some of the customer content be processed and stored in an IT system that remains within a specific locality's borders or a geographical location. And that may or may not be specific to one country, or depending on how the regulation is written. If you take the Kenya DPA as per example, data can be processed outside of the country's borders as long as it's placed into the same type of legal regime that is equal or more stringent than the current local DPA says. The data sovereignty is the control and governance over who can and cannot have legal access to the data. So it's all the legalities around who has access to the data, but more importantly, its location and the usage thereof, and the access by the government itself or the legalities. If you look at data localization, that is almost like a subset or a specific regionally challenge from data residency, in it's the strictest version of data residency predicated on legal obligations. So that typically requires that either a copy of all the data be held within the country's borders, and that's specific to a country, and it usually guarantees the relevant government also access to the data. So that's why we say it's very strict and very rigorous, and that's something that one needs to understand what the implications are when you're working with cloud and also in public cloud environments such as AWS. Thanks, we can go on. So when we address the compliance and the security issues, I'm just going to give you a quick refresher as to the shared responsibility model. I've been told that luckily you've gone through this in previous sessions, but the shared responsibility model means that if you look at your data levels and application levels, that is managed by the customer itself. So the customer needs to apply the correct security mechanisms and controls to appease the requirements for compliance and for security itself. The customer makes use of all the services that we as AWS makes available in the security of the cloud. So if you look at the foundational services, our global infrastructure, so we look at our compute, storage, databases, networking, those are all the services that we have, and it has been built to specific international standards, and it's been certified and attested to, and I'll get to that just now. But the customer then makes use of these services, specifically the data storage in this case, but all the security controls and the storage and the placement of the data becomes that responsibility of the customer. We move on to the next slide. In addressing localization or residency requirements, we just need to extend the shared responsibility model in that it might have a proviso that we have a hybrid type of environment. And in a hybrid type of environment, the customer needs to have a local copy of the data, meaning local data storage or a local data center implication. But it's still in a hybrid environment, meaning AWS is still being used for majority of the services, but some of the data is localized on the data center of the customer. But I'm not sure if you've advanced the slide, but it's not showing yet. Thanks. So there you can see the customer responsibility also extends to the customer data center, where the hybrid environment comes in, and that control needs to be managed and controlled as well. Then we can move on to the next slide. So when we talk about all these services and the sureties, and Haj in the previous session also talked about how do we prove all of this? How are you comfortable with the services that you get from AWS? All our services are built to specific standards, but more importantly, these standards need to be attested by and audited by third-party independent auditors. So you'll see that a number of certifications, and I listed most of the certifications, the laws and regulations, and privacy certifications as well, our alignments to international standards and frameworks. All of these that you see in front of you, all of the programs has been independently audited, verified, certified, and you've got the independent audit reports as a customer to go and get all of this. Why is this relevant? Because that is the surety that we give you that our service is firstly compliant to all of these levels of security and international standards as well. But the customer can also, when they're working with the regulator, to get approval for working on the cloud or explaining what the architecture and everything looks like. The security of the cloud is now an attested report that you can provide to the regulator. If we move to the next slide, we provide all the customers, such as yourself and partners as well, a portal where you can go and log in, and it's called AWS Artifact. And in that portal, you as a customer log in as your root user, and you actually obtain the specific certificate or regulation that you want, the audit report that is relevant to yourself and for the compliance regime that you're addressing. So once you log in there, you will ask for, let's say, 27001 ISO certificate. You get that, and that is more importantly watermarked with your company name as a customer, and it's got all the controls down to all the specifications of that specific certification, how it was audited, by whom, and how it was ticked off, and if any findings were found, and how it was addressed and remediated. So that is our compliance of the cloud and how we prove the assurance of our services being built to specific standards. It's well documented, it's certified, and attested to. Move to the next slide. Part of the security of the cloud is also to make sure that the resilience, as I spoke right in the beginning, that resilience is becoming more a topic, and also surety of the cloud. How do you know that if something goes wrong, that there's backup redundancy built into it? AWS currently spans over 26 geographical regions, and that expands drastically quick because I also serve and work on the global expansions team. So I know there's a number of regions coming. And each of our regions has got availability zones appended to it. So if we talk about a region, let's say Frankfurt region or Cape Town region, we know that there's a number of availability zones that comprise of that region. At a minimum 2, typically it's 3. And each of these regions is comprised of availability zones. And in the availability zones, there are data centers, a number of data centers itself. We also have different types of points of presences also to make sure that the latency and your access to the network is guaranteed, and that we have availability on speed and all of that covered. And we're also extending to local zones, which are being announced all the time. And the local zones relevant to Africa is that we're going to have one in Johannesburg and in Cape Town to extend the African footprint. And we can move to the next slide. Thanks. So whilst that is coming up, it's just a breakdown of what a region looks like. So in a region, we sit with a number of availability zones. And in an availability zone, they're all exact replicas and copies of the number of data centers that comprise the availability zone. The most important thing to remind yourself and to know about our global infrastructure and why I bring this up is each and every data center, each and every zone, each and every region that we have. I think Fuad, you went backwards instead of forward. Each of these zones are certified on all those certification programs, laws, regulations, and frameworks that I talked about earlier at launch and ongoing. So I wouldn't say it's irrelevant to which region you choose, but whatever region you choose to host your data in, you know that it's got the same level of security assurance and certifications as all of the other regions has. Thanks. We can move to the next slide. So why it is important and what you need to understand when we talk about data security and addressing the highest standards of data security within this environment. First, you need to meet your data residency requirements and sometimes data localization requirements. So when you as a customer choose the region to host your data in, be that Cape Town, be that one of the European countries as a region, you as a customer has the surety that AWS does not replicate any data out of a region. So once a customer places his data, let's say it's in Dublin, Ireland, that data will stay within the availability zones of that region. It does not go outside of the borders of that country. So in that way, you immediately speak on your data residency requirements. Obviously, you need to verify with your Data Protection Act of that country, also have legal view and review of that Data Protection Act to make sure that when you choose a region that it conforms to the requirements of the Data Protection Act. A very important aspect of security, specifically when you talk to regulators and when they want to stress on security controls, is typically revert to encryption as one of the best controls that you can apply. Important thing about encryption is the customer controls the keys. We as AWS, yes, we make the KMS, key management services, and the cloud HSS as services available to our customers to use, but the customers control and own the keys. That means we do not have access to the customer data, as we always claim. And that also means that you have the surety and you can provide the surety to the regulator that you solely have access to the data itself. You also need to comply with the local laws and privacy regulations by implementing other security controls such as identity and access management as to whom has got access to the content, keep trace of what that is the auditability of everything, and then also very important, the life cycle of the data and the disposal. And in the disposal, that's again where we both share a responsibility. Once you select make the selection of destroying data, we at the physical layer, we actually physically destroy hard drives, and we have a whole process which is recorded and all of that, which we can present in our certification reports to the regulators that actual content has been destroyed. And I'm not sure if you're seeing still the presentation or not. If you don't see the last slide, I can just talk to you quickly about the last slide, which is just
I lost connection. I'm back. Should be education for regulators.
Thanks. There we go. So in speaking to regulators from our side, the sessions that I took have is very similar to what I have just with you. Obviously, time constraints that we have now. We have much longer in-depth sessions with our regulators. We go through the shared responsibility model with them. We go through encryption and all the other security controls that there are, much more in depth, both on the technical and on the process and people side of things as well. We explain to them the control of the content and the data, which is in the control of the customer itself. And we also explain how regions work and the data within regions stay resident to those regions. And just the last slide, you can move one forward, please. So in the last slide, you talk about, again, the contractual requirements also that we address is that in all our contracts, all our enterprise agreements, we make sure that firstly, the exit clauses are captured in there. We make sure that the customer is protected from a lock-in from us, and that the portability is specified specifically for data moving in and out of our cloud. And we also make tools available, and we document what tools are available for moving data into and out of the AWS cloud. We also have links within our enterprise agreement to the GDPR, which is a very good guideline and framework that we specify and use to basically specify all the data protection controls and security controls that we apply. And then obviously we've spoken about security of the cloud, in the cloud, that is just more the process that we have. And I can finish off that we do have with regulators under NDA specific programs that we enroll them. We go into very deep level and information sharing down to our CERT processes, which is our incident reporting and incident response. And that is actually handled by our Office of the CISO, where we actually share that type of information as an intelligence sharing exercise, because if you look at cybercrime, all of that around the world, I wouldn't say it's a losing battle, but there's much more adversaries than there are good guys like us. So it's good to educate our regulators and our customers alike to make sure that we all have a more compliant and safe environment out there. So it's been brief. Happy to have questions at the end, but also have more in-depth sessions later on. And that's my story around data security and compliance.